We are talking today about staying nonpartisan during voter engagement, especially for 501c3 organizations. So we're going to be talking about the prohibition on partisan political activity, nonpartisan voter registration, as well as voter education and get out the vote, how you can keep those efforts nonpartisan. Then a big topic I get asked about a lot is engaging candidates. We'll also cover issue advocacy, ballot measures, and what staff are allowed to do. I now want to introduce our speaker. So David has been doing these webinars even before I was working with Nonprofit Vote, and he's quite an expert on this topic. So his practice focuses on the representation of nonprofit and tax-exempt organizations with an emphasis on program-related investments, social enterprise, political advocacy, and nonprofit corporate governance. David is a principal at Adler and Colvin, and he has been providing really excellent sort of information that helps us as nonprofits navigate the waters around voter engagement, issue advocacy, and more. So thank you so much for being here once more, David. And
2024 is going to be a big year, obviously 2023 as well. We're still discussing and in some cases still disputing results from the elections, both in 2020 and the midterms. We've had very recent Supreme Court decisions that I think people are going to want to talk about, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. And of course, we're just about a year after the Dobbs decision. So we have non-election related big developments that may very well have an impact on the election. And lots of charities may want to talk about these developments and get people out to vote. We've already seen that in the midterms following the Dobbs election. So I think, we're expecting it to be a very active season. And as people involved in the campaigns know, we're already in the season now. So Caitlin already went through what we are going to cover. I like to just also preface, just to be clear, what we're not going to cover, just so you know that there's some other rules out there. Of course, happy to answer questions, but I'm going to address the tax rules for tax-exempt organizations under Section 501c3. I'm going to be talking about public charities. Private foundations have their own rules to some extent. Both public charities and private foundations cannot get involved in a partisan way in elections. That'll be the same, but there are a few cases where private foundations have some stricter rules. I will mention that, but not really go over those rules. I'm really focusing on 501c3 public charities. And of course, there are other types of exempt organizations. Most commonly in the election-related area, we see 501c4 organizations. What they can do is different. Again, happy to answer questions, happy to talk about how a charity and a social welfare organization may work together, but we're really going to focus on public charities. Number two, I'm focusing on tax law. So there's, of course, campaign finance law. There's state, federal, and local campaign finance laws that if there is involvement in an election, they may come into play as well. We're going to be talking about tax exempt status and what a charity can and cannot do with respect to its status under the tax code. And last but not least, this is going to be about candidates and election-related activities. There's an entirely different regime under the tax code that governs what charities can do with respect to lobbying on legislation. So that is a topic maybe for another day to the extent there's interest, but we're really talking about voting, candidates, elections. I like to always start with what this is called the Johnson Amendment. And for those who don't recognize him, that there on the right is President Johnson. This is the language in the tax code that was actually put in place in 1954. So it's not always been in the tax code. And this is where the entire prohibition we're going to be talking about, this is where it comes from. This is still the law that charities including churches, cannot get involved in partisan politics. And this language is still in the code. So what does that mean? What does that language mean in the code? Well, most obviously, a charity cannot endorse a candidate or support or oppose a political party. And also fairly obviously, I think straightforward, it's just a charity. You cannot donate money or provide resources to a candidate or party. I think where we're going to spend most of our times is talking about the third bullet point. What does it mean to conduct partisan election-related activities? For tax purposes, the IRS will look at all the facts and circumstances to determine whether an event would be considered partisan. If it is partisan, that would be considered campaign intervention. That is the activity that a 501c3 public charity cannot conduct. And the set of activities that a charity cannot conduct is much broader than what may be regulated under the election laws, the federal state election laws that I mentioned earlier. So if someone says that, it has to mention a candidate explicitly, and therefore, if we don't mention a candidate, it's not electioneering. Well, the tax laws don't really work that way. As we'll see, it is a broader law than the election law. It picks up more. So again, applying this facts and circumstances test, the IRS has interpreted what a charity can do in a variety of election-related scenarios, as long as these activities are conducted in a nonpartisan manner. So we are going, in each of the areas bullet pointed here, we actually have some guidance from the IRS on how you can conduct voter registration, voter education, get out the vote efforts, candidate engagement, and by different ways in which, as a charity, you can, in fact, talk to candidates, always which you can do that in a nonpartisan way. So what does that mean? First, just very generally, before we get into the specifics of certain activities, very generally, an activity is considered nonpartisan if it is not biased or for or against a candidate, and it is not structured in some way to help or hurt the chances that that candidate will be elected or not be elected. So again, facts and circumstances, and the IRS has laid out some of those facts and circumstances to consider, but the IRS can look at everything to determine whether or not that event is being held in some way that shows a bias for or against a candidate. So that's what we need to avoid. And the flip side of that is if you can do an educational activity in a nonpartisan way, and without benefiting or hurting a candidate, then that would be permissible charitable activity if it's furthering a charitable purpose. Now, unfortunately, there's no comprehensive statutory guidance on what nonpartisan means. So that's why you have to look at the guidance we have and sort of interpret it in all these different situations. Great when we have something like voter registration, we know what the IRS has to say about that. But there's plenty of areas where the IRS has not issued a lot of guidance. The IRS tends to be a little bit behind with respect, at least in this area, with respect to new technology. So, we had a revenue ruling in 2007 that was extremely helpful, and went as far as to address websites, which we can talk about a bit. But that ruling, if you think about it, it's already 14 years old. No, it's, it's actually closer to 15 years old. And we don't have a lot of meaningful guidance. It's more reading the tea leaves as far as how do we take the IRS guidance and apply it to social media, right? When the guidance on websites came out, we didn't even have really Twitter and Facebook. And so we have to sort of apply the guidance we have to this new technology. We don't have a lot of new guidance in these areas. And as I mentioned, there is a revenue ruling from 2007-41, that I think is the last comprehensive ruling addressing partisan campaign activities for charities that we have. So now let's first talk about voter registration, education, and get out the vote efforts. As I was saying, this is an important point. It is charitable. It can be charitable activity to encourage people to participate in the electoral process. You just can't tell them who to vote for. And so voter registration, get out the vote, is legitimate activity. It's considered civic duty. It is a positive thing to increase the number of people voting. And get people out to the ballot box. So here are some guidelines that I think are helpful. First of all, obviously, no endorsements. The voter registration process largely is governed by state law, and it varies from state to state. So many charities want to basically deprive an educational component of just helping people understand, navigate the rules, understand what they need to do to be able to vote, get them registered, maybe encourage them to vote when election day arrives. That would all be legitimate charitable activities. So providing the facts on the process of voting, again, here are good just examples of the kinds of things that are absolutely fine to do as a charity. Again, because as you can see, this is all about getting people out to vote. You don't know how they're going to vote. They may vote overwhelmingly. In the area which you're in, they may vote overwhelmingly Democratic or Republican. You don't know. We'll get to whether you know or not, but more importantly, the activities when you are encouraging people to vote, you don't know how that person you are talking to is going to vote, or if you do, that can't be relevant to and influence the information that you are giving, which needs to be done for everybody, regardless of how they're going to vote. So activities designed to help people to register to vote, to get to the polls. That is fine. That is legitimate charitable activities. This is, by the way, when I mentioned that there are some very specific rules for private foundations, charities that are private foundations as opposed to public charities. Maybe some of your funders are private foundations. You should just know that voter registration is one of those areas. Not get out the vote. I mean, when I'm talking about voter registration, I mean getting people actually registered to vote. Private foundations have some specific rules. So if you are involved with the private foundation, you have questions about that, you can contact me separately. We're going to focus on public charities. Both private foundations and public charities can get out the vote, however, as long as we're not talking about voter registration. Here are, again, things that can be done that are legitimate get out the vote activities. I will, again, you can look at the slide. I'll use this opportunity just to sort of summarize the do's and don'ts for voter registration and get out the vote. What you can do is make sure everyone's aware of and are following the local and state rules, and get accurate information, put people in touch with election officials. You can train staff and volunteers in terms of conducting these activities. What they need to understand when you train your staff is that these activities need to be conducted in nonpartisan fashion. What does that mean? If voter registration, if get out the vote activities will be what your organization is involved in, those individuals who are doing this work, volunteers or staff, that cannot express support or opposition to candidates or parties during this event. So they should not be wearing shirts, buttons, anything candidate related. We need to keep that, even if on a personal level they support a candidate, your volunteers, when they're conducting this activity, that no expression of support or opposition should be involved when you're doing the get out the vote efforts. There should be no suggestion which party to vote for, and you certainly can't turn people away or not provide the information due to information they may have provided. So, and this can be tricky because people might, when you are talking to them, may want your opinion on who to vote for. They may want to start discussing partisan activities. I think it's important to train your staff and volunteers to understand that that is not a conversation that they should be having. You can tell callers that this is a charitable activity. As a charity, we do not support or oppose candidates. And really, I think the training is helpful too, because, in the off chance you can't really control, if you have 100 people involved, you can't control every conversation, everything that might be said. If there are partisan conversations, I think it's a very helpful fact if you can show as a charity that you trained, you did the training, you explained to people what they're expected to do and not to do, and you really made every effort to make it a nonpartisan activity. So again, and I can't emphasize enough, because there's an example of this, in the revenue ruling that I mentioned, that if you were talking to people going door to door by the phone, we see scripts all the time, and you need to provide that information regardless of how questions are answered and how they're going to vote. So you are not providing the information differently based on expected preferences for a candidate or a party. Okay, I think, just in the interest of time, I'm going to keep it moving along. I think this one other point I want to make before we get on to candidate engagement, which is a charity, this is an important point, a charity can target certain areas based on them, the area being low income, for the time being, at least in light of the recent Supreme Court decisions, you can target an area based on low income or minority or low voter turnout historically, even if these are areas where they are typically or historically likely to vote one way or the other. I mean, for a specific party or candidate. So in other words, if there is a natural reason to be targeting those areas because they are historically underrepresented, here these areas are people historically have had low voting records, or it's your natural constituency, like we are helping Black and brown people with a lot of things, and that's for our natural charities mission. We're also going to get out the vote efforts in those areas. The fact that people in those areas tend to vote overwhelmingly Republican or Democratic is not a problem, as long as, again, the activities are not partisan. So you can target specific areas if what you're doing is encouraging voting by all people who are eligible in those areas. And again, you need to distinguish that from targeting in any way where you have information about their affiliate with a political party or how they voted in the past. So again, an entirely different area. Now we're talking about how can you educate voters. Again, getting people out to vote, legitimate charitable activities. It is also a legitimate educational activity to tell people not only to vote, but to educate them about who's on the ballot, what are their positions, what is a candidate's take on a particular issue. So we're talking a little bit about different ways in which a charity can be involved with a candidate. When you leave here, at the very least, you should not be intimidated or feel like you need to shy away from talking to people who are in office or who are candidates. There are definitely tried and true ways in which, as a charity, you can have those conversations and bring those people in to your charity, to an event, following certain guidelines regarding how you keep that a nonpartisan. So one key point is candidate versus non-candidate capacity. We'll talk about that. A person may be appearing as a candidate, such as in a debate, or they're coming to talk about their candidacy. But a lot of these individuals also have things they've done outside of being a candidate, and they might be asked to appear at an event in a non-candidate capacity. So we'll talk about the difference there. Debates and forums we'll cover. And again, so this is a nice little summary, but why don't we get to some of the details about some of these different events? I think I want to first talk about, I'll start with in a non-candidate capacity, because this slide largely talks about in a candidate capacity. So first, just to get this out of the way, keep in mind that if somebody's invited solely for reasons other than their candidacy, and they don't talk about their candidacy, that may be a legitimate reason to have somebody attend your event. They may be a candidate, but the person may have also been a CEO in their former life, or even to talk about policy positions they had as a former office holder, whatever they've done in their former life. The point is that is a person who is a figure who has a reason to be there other than their candidacy. And this is important because if that's the case, you don't necessarily need to invite everybody else and all the candidates to have the same opportunity. They can speak at your event. It can be open to the public, but the key is they cannot address their candidacy. They cannot have campaign materials. They can't even mention their candidacy. So there's a nice set of guidelines in this revenue rung that I mentioned. And this is what, as a charity, you want to document both before you decide to have the event and when you invite this person, is that they're being invited to speak in a non-candidate capacity. And then all the factors I generally mentioned about ways in which you just keep the event nonpartisan, no discussion on the election. And you just you make sure that's really a nonpartisan atmosphere where they're there for a different reason. And one of the things you may need to do is just really make sure the person speaking understands. And sometimes we provide a memo to those individuals so they understand, look, this is a charity event. In order to not jeopardize our tax-exempt status, we need you not to do these things. And again, the more that both educates the people who will be there, the people speaking, but also helps provide some defense if things go off the rails. You do everything you can to keep it nonpartisan. Now, what about inviting somebody in their candidate capacity? So you can, in fact, invite someone to speak at the organization as a political candidate, The key here is, and this is where we start to get the issues, is when you want to, everything these rules are about two things. They are about not giving somebody more of an opportunity than a different candidate, and they are about not demonstrating some sort of implicit approval or disapproval of the candidate when they are at the event. So we look at these as sort of forum. I will distinguish between a forum and a debate, meaning a forum is going to be largely when people come sequentially. So maybe you're going to have a speaker series, and then people are going to, you're given an opportunity to get to know the candidate, but they're going to be appearing at different times. So I'll use the term forum to refer to that, where your candidates appear sequentially. Again, I think here it's important, as it says at the top of the slide, you do want to cover a broad range of topics that the candidate would be expected to address if they were elected. Why does it matter there's a broad range of issues or topics? Simply because it's less likely or easy to implicitly express a view on the candidate based on their view on issues. So for instance, if you are an environmental organization, you focus only on a very specific environmental issue, it's easier to tie your position as an organization on the issue with the candidate's position, and the candidate is in favor of what you're in favor of, it will appear that you're endorsing the candidate, and vice versa. The point is, if you have a broader range of issues, it's easier to demonstrate that this is really about educating. It's not about getting people to vote for or against this candidate, but educating the voters on all of these issues. And so really the purpose is the educational content, not a thinly veiled agenda of addressing something where you really care about the viewpoint of the candidate. What you're trying to do is educate people on what those viewpoints are, on all the kinds of things that the person may need to address if they are elected. So that's a broad range of issues. Equal opportunity to all candidates. This is important. One thing the IRS has said is they will look at the nature of the event in addition to the manner of the presentation. So in other words, if you invite one candidate to speak at your dinner on a Friday at 5 p.m. with a high turnout, and another candidate next week to speak at an early Sunday morning meeting where you get a much lower turnout, the IRS is likely not to consider that an equal opportunity. So you really want to do everything you can to make sure you're treating the candidates equally and fairly. And again, when there is actually an event, you don't want to imply approval or disapproval in any way. So what happens if all the candidates, this happens quite often, do not attend? This is difficult because it really depends on the facts and circumstances. If you have invited many candidates and only one doesn't appear, then you may be able to continue having the event. But if you have two candidates and one doesn't appear, it may be difficult to continue the event because it may be that it's just too difficult to not indicate that you're supporting one candidate over the other when you only have one candidate who's involved. But at the very least, if you're going to continue with an event, you want to make it very clear that every candidate was invited and had the opportunity to participate. Each candidate should be given equal time to express their views. They should not be asked to agree to a specific position or platform, because again, that implies endorsement or opposition if they refuse. So it's really important that all the candidates are invited and they have the opportunity to express their viewpoints without any indication whether the organization agrees or did not agree. And the moderator should stay neutral. So again, unfortunately, the name of the game is facts and circumstances, which means anything, you want to look at how the moderator is treating the candidates, giving them equal opportunity, and making sure everyone's treated in a fair manner. Now, it's not always practical for an organization to invite all of the candidates, especially if there's a large number of legally qualified candidates for a particular office. We've seen this in California with respect to, for instance, the recall, and we might see it in the Republican primaries as well. It just may not be practical. So the IRS has indicated that it is permissible for a charity to invite fewer than all of the candidates if there's a reasonable objective criteria that you're using, and you're using it consistently, not arbitrarily. So in other words, maybe you're only inviting candidates that receive a certain threshold of, in the recent polling, a certain threshold of minimum support or a certain threshold of minimum campaign dollars that they've raised, something you're just going to apply across the board. And so you're only going to invite maybe 5 out of the top 8 candidates because that's the time that you have to provide a floor or forum. But it's important, I think, to document that well, because as you might imagine, any candidate who doesn't get invited is not necessarily going to be happy, right? So they may want to criticize the fact that we're not invited. So I think it's important you have a well-documented reason as to how you set that objective criteria. And again, unfortunately, when a candidate refuses to participate, it's a judgment call. It really is a judgment call about whether or not to go forward. And I think where we find it to be most difficult is when only one candidate accepts, and that therefore it really looks like a platform for one candidate as opposed to an equal opportunity forum. So I think before we go to the next slide, I'll just briefly mention the other area in which you see this is not sequential appearances, but actual debates. You have the candidates there on the same stage, and similar rules apply. And again, you just want to make sure that questions are on a wide range of topics, and everyone's getting a equal opportunity to speak at the debate. So it's sort of a little bit more moderation is necessary in terms, or there's a greater pressure on the moderator because now you have everyone in one place, and you have to try very hard to make sure that every candidate is being treated the same. Candidate questionnaires, as opposed to voter guides, are materials that actually compare. These are opportunities to compare the guidance and provide the public information about what the candidate's position are on different issues. The information on voter guides is often gathered through questionnaires. And so, you can send questions to candidates, you can gather information from public sources such as campaign websites, and also you can look at legislative records. The key here is, again, the name of the game is how do you do this in a way that doesn't seem to favor or oppose one candidate over the others? I know it's in writing, right? So there's an opportunity. An obvious way to start is you're distributing to all the candidates running for office. I think, again, less of a practical concern about space as you have with a forum. But you could, again, if you're only going to ask certain candidates, you need an objective basis on who you're going to include. Wide range of questions would apply again, but you want to have an opportunity to, again, the questions should be neutral and the candidates should have an opportunity to respond in their own words, if possible. And you should, the least amount of editing you do, the better. In other words, every time you don't include verbatim what the candidate's providing you, there's an opportunity to claim that the editing was not done in an objective fashion. So we often, maybe just have a ground rule about exactly how many words you're going to publish, and you publish that. And you don't summarize if the answer is too long. And that might even mean cutting off an answer in the middle, because you're just applying a very objective rule about how you're going to portray the information that those candidates provide you. So again, you want to cover a broad range of topics and give the candidates an opportunity to express their viewpoint with as little editing as possible. And you certainly don't want to rank or comment on the candidate's responses, because that's the kind of thing that gets already into trouble. This was an actual voter guide from the Bush-Gore election. And you can see that it is a voter guide that has plenty of problems if you were to do a voter guide by a charity. It is a good example of what we don't want to do. In particular, it compares the candidates' positions and makes it clear that one is sort of favorable to the other, just in terms of the language that is used, right? We have a check mark on one side, we have a thumbs down over here. Weakened clean air health standards is a very, it's not coming directly from the candidate, and it's a very subjective way to portray what George W. Bush had done. So you look at this, and it's on one particular topic. So you don't even have a wide range of issues. This would be an example of kind of a roadmap of how you would not want to do a voter guide if you're trying to be nonpartisan. Why, you might ask, you would say, was the Sierra Club here not well advised? Well, no, that's not really the concern, because this was a 501c4 organization. So again, something we're not going to get into very much on this webinar, but the important thing to understand is if you're not a C3 and you were a 501c4 organization, you are allowed to conduct a certain amount of partisan activity, and this would fall on the partisan side. So if you have an organization that really wants to get out a message that may be biased for or against a candidate, you may want to look at working through a different type of tax-exempt organization that is allowed to do things like this, that it's not, again, it's not a explicit statement of voting for or against a candidate, but it's clearly providing information in a way that would support or oppose a candidate. And if you're doing this as a 501c4 organization, you are permitted to do something like this. We did cover this a bit in the voter guide above. What you want to do is you don't want to in any way express preference for one over the other. So it's okay to compare candidates in the sense that you are providing both their viewpoints on a particular issue and a range of issues. So somebody reviewing, the general public can compare their positions on various issues, but you want to keep the organization's viewpoint out of it. You don't want to rank positions, which we'll get to at the bottom really, but you want to keep your opinion out of it. Criticizing it's a little bit more difficult because you want to avoid making positive or negative statements about candidates. You may correct factual misstatements. You also can talk about, if somebody has been in office, it is okay to talk about policies and criticism of certain things that have been done during that person's administration. But you want to keep your comments about the policy and not about the individual. So this is maybe a harder place to draw the line. But if you don't like the policy with respect to the war in Ukraine or Iraq, you can be very critical about that policy issue. as we get a little further down, we'll talk about issue advocacy, and I'll move quickly because I see we're getting towards the question point. But I will say that what you don't want to do is let that criticism of a policy could bleed into comments like somebody's incompetent for office, or they're a liar, or they're dishonest. But now you're making statements about the candidate, and that kind of criticism would not be permissible for a charity. This is where it's a little tricky, because charities can engage in activities where they talk about positions. A charity can have a position on an issue, of course, and that position doesn't go away just because we're in an election period. So the tax law allows organizations to engage in issue advocacy, but not, and it also allows organizations to use the occasion of election to really try to draw attention and obtain greater exposure for their issues of concern. But what they cannot do is start to use those issues as an implicit way of telling people how to vote on a specific candidate or group of issues. So the IRS is most likely to consider this a problem when it's a high profile issue in which the candidates in an election are clearly diverging on their views. So we often review that as a wedge issue. And unfortunately, as we get further, and into a partisan atmosphere, more and more issues seem to be really wedge issues. Like, it's hard to talk. It used to be, we felt gun owners' rights or gun control, abortion, or right to choose, right to life, but we're very wedge issues in the sense that you have an election and you have candidates who are clearly on both sides of those issues. So even if you don't mention a candidate or talk about their supporter if you don't support or oppose that candidate, if you focus on an issue and you identify that issue with the candidate, that could be enough. And the IRS's and the Internal Revenue Code regime to indicate that you were implicitly supporting or opposing a candidate because of their view on that issue. And the more issues that become partisan, the more this is a greater risk. And so the IRS has put forth some specific factors that are important to consider anytime you're doing issue advocacy during an election cycle. And the kind of things you want to consider are, first of all, when you're doing issue advocacy, are you even mentioning a candidate for office? And the more of these that you have to check, yes, we are doing, the greater risk you create. So it is a fact and circumstances balancing act. But we're talking about like questions like, did you mention a candidate in your advocacy? Was your advocacy close to an election? The further away from the election, the safer it is. Obviously, the closer to an election, the greater risk that it will look like you're trying to influence that election. The IRS also look at factors like whether the issue has been raised as an issue distinguishing the candidates. Again, many races, it's clear on what side of the issue somebody may fall on, whether it's addressing, forgiving student debt, or, the classics of right to life, right to choose. If you focus on an issue, it's clearly separating the candidates, it's close in time to the election, and you mention the candidate and their position on that issue, greater risk that that issue advocacy could be impermissible candidate intervention, because what it looks like you're doing is telegraphing people how to vote based on that candidate's view on the issue. One last point I'll mention on this is a positive fact is if you can point to a non-electoral reason to be addressing that issue at the time. So for instance, if there's a scheduled vote on legislation and it's coming up next week and the elections come up after that, there's a strong reason to maybe advocate and put pressure on that person to vote for or against a piece of legislation. That would be a non-electoral reason to advocate on that issue, completely separate from their candidacy. And so that may give you some cover for your communication. So you always want to look for non-electoral reasons and ask yourself, are we doing this now because we're trying to influence the election? Or are we really trying to focus on the issue and not tell people how to vote based on that candidate's position on the issue? Very quickly on ballot measures. Ballot measure activities are considered lobbying. So we are looking at the IRS permits express advocacy on ballot measures. You can, as a charity, support or oppose ballot measures, but this is subject to the charity's limits on its legislative lobbying. So it is not an election-related impermissible activity. It is a lobbying activity. So we have to look at the charity's lobbying rules and what is the amount is permitted to spend on lobbying to determine how much you can do in terms of ballot measure activity. So again, that's a topic for a legislative lobbying webinar. But I will add the second point, which is that if a ballot measure is very closely identified with the candidate, who has either publicly endorsed or opposed the measure, you want to be careful as to whether or not you get to the same issue you have with issue advocacy of whether or not by attacking the ballot measure, you are implicitly saying don't vote for this candidate. The other thing I would say is just keep in mind, if you do ballot measure activities, this is one of those areas where you do have a situation where there is law outside tax law you need to think about with respect to campaign finance. Many states, California included, have rules about registration and reporting and disclosure if you're going to support or oppose a ballot measure. So we're going to talk briefly about what staff can and cannot do. The key point for staff is you don't sort of check in your First Amendment rights because you're working for a charity. You continue to be able as an individual to participate in an election. But what we need to do is make sure as an individual that your activities are not attributable to the charity by the IRS. With respect to any of these activities, the key is, I think I usually talk this in two sort of categories. One is use of charities' resources. So if you're going to be attending a campaign or attending political events, showing candidate support, you can't use charity resources to do that. So and that all the details matter here. So you don't want, if someone is going to engage personally in activities involving a campaign or election, don't use the charity's facilities or the resources for campaign work. Don't use photocopiers, don't use the telephones, mailing permits. You want to keep the charity resources out of the campaign activities, because we can't have the charity subsidize that political work in any way. That can be impermissible campaign intervention. You also don't want to use your compensated time for conducting those activities. So when on vacation, on personal days, on unpaid leave, but not on paid staff time, generally speaking, staff time is a charity resource as well and shouldn't be used for electioneering. The other thing we talk about is attribution, which is we don't want to have the charity's name used in connection with that. If you, as a staff member, are engaging in any personal political activities, keep the charity's name out of it as well. We don't want stationary logos. We don't want the charity's email account or phones used. We don't want to see a charity's email address. We don't want to see when a statement's made that there's any attribution to the charity. And what that may mean is that there may be situations where you need to use a disclaimer. So if as an individual, you're closely identified with the charity, and the charity's name may even be used, say, for instance, if you're going to be quoted in the newspaper, we may want a clear statement that these are personal activities and that they do not indicate support or opposition from the charity. So disclaimers are very helpful when you're going to have statements. If you identify with the charity's name will be identified. We don't want any of your personal viewpoints to be attributed to the organization. Sometimes you need to monitor this. We have many cases where a charity event occurs or someone makes a statement and in the press it was incorrectly attributed to the organization. Sometimes you would want to even request a correction. And those corrections may or may not get published, but we have seen situations where even writing to the paper to tell them that was a mistake was helpful on an audit. So you want to sort of monitor and make sure that political statements by individuals are not being attributed to the organization. You want to avoid using nonprofit resources, as I said, and you want to avoid, and when you are doing partisan activities, to have any attribution to the charity that might suggest it was a charity's activity. So again, here are some examples of things you want to avoid if you're doing personal activities, not including, you want to sort of keep the charity's name out of it when you can, and when you can't, you will want to use some disclaimers. Now, I think we're getting close to the end, so I want to open up for questions. And in the process of answering questions, I think making some questions on social media, and we could talk a little bit about that. But given that we've got a few minutes, about 10, 15 minutes left, let me open it up for questions now.
We have so many questions. We'll try to get through them as many as possible. Right out the gate, there were some questions about voting rights. And this is a hard one, not starting with a softball. Do you have any guidance around how organizations can talk about voting rights, especially now that it's become more seen as partisan or political. For instance, we have someone who works with the League of Women Voters. They've been invited to speak about some of the restrictions or changes to their state's voting laws. Then they're not sure if they can really do that.
Yeah.
So any guidance there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we're going to see more of that. So I think the issue is twofold, right? First of all, voting rights is a legitimate topic to educate people on and to be concerned about as a charity. And so I think on one front, when we don't have specific guidance, we look to the very general guidance on issue advocacy, which is, can you talk about that issue without talking about candidates? So I think, yes, this is, if your focus is on people having the right to vote and there's laws being passed that affect voting rights or issues coming up affecting voting rights, as a charity, you can address that. What were some of those points I mentioned about issue advocacy? Well, I mean, a lot of those communications, again, each factor you have to check off as including maybe increases the risk. Can you talk about the voting rights without talking about candidates, right? I think where you have, and that, that's within your control, right? I think where it gets a little harder is if it's an issue where it's clearly something that the candidates in an election have stated their positions, and we've seen that more and more, right, with voting rights. I think that means that I would say, one, you don't have to stop talking about the issue because there's an election. I say because if it's an issue that divides the candidate, there is greater risk. And I should mention that some of this is risk tolerance, right? I think there is some gray area about how you can do. We know you can't talk about this issue and say candidate X is terrible because they're supporting all these laws that are proposed laws that are going to restrict voting rights. Can't do that. But if you decide this is an important issue and you're willing to accept some more risk, if it's an issue that separates the candidates, you won't be able to say that's without risk, but you want to do it in such a way as you're trying to avoid shedding a positive or negative light on any candidate who might have identified on that issue. So that's the best I can say. I mean, how much risk are you willing to accept to focus on this issue? And you want to focus on the issue as much as you can without criticizing or supporting a candidate who happens to support or oppose the issue.
Great. Okay. So we've got a lot about working with candidates.
Yeah.
Here's one that I felt was very novel. I hadn't heard this one before. It's a C3 organization hosting an in-person training. I don't think it doesn't sound like the training is about voting, but a local state rep offered their community space in the district office to them for free. They will not be discussing election-related issues. Are they okay to use that space?
So who's providing the space? It's the candidate?
Local state representative.
Okay, so it's not personal. It's not government space. It's.
It says, yeah, a local state rep offered their community space in their district office to us for free. So
yeah,
it is a district office.
I should preface is it's kind of like what you said, right? None of this is legal advice because I wouldn't be able to give legal advice anyway, but especially in this area, it's so heavily fact specific that, the answers to some of these questions is going to make the difference, right? Like, I do think usually the issue is the opposite of the way around, where the charity's providing the space to a candidate. Can you do that? And the answer may be, yeah, you do it if you do it and you give everybody candidate the same opportunity. Here, I mean, I'm not sure if it's the public space, I think would be fine. If it's the candidate space, probably looking at things like, does that suggest are we showing support or for that candidate? And you really have to look at all the facts and circumstances to see whether or not that would be the case. So, and sometimes you may just need to talk to legal counsel, because I do think this stuff's very heavily fact specific. And sometimes it is a question of risk tolerance. We might say there's a range of activities you could do here. Some are pushing the envelope more than others. And you may decide we really care about this issue and we're going to do it. This one, I think we need more facts to really, reach a conclusion.
It sounds like it is a district office, not a campaign office. So it sounds like it's probably okay, but maybe double check.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's usually the issue is just associated with the candidate. If it's, it seems to me there's at least an avenue for doing that. And then you start looking at questions like, how is an event going to be conducted in such a way that, a reasonable person would say it's not biased in any way for or against a candidate.
We have some about candidate forums.
Okay.
And what to do if an audience member asks a partisan question.
Yeah.
For example, do you support X party's position on Y issue? And then a follow-up question that maybe you can answer them together. Can candidates make statements that include any variation of, if elected, I will take XYZ action? Yeah. And maybe it's a candidate forum, or maybe they're not supposed to be talking about their candidacy.
And I think that's the key. I think, two very different types of forums. First of all, the forum where this is really supposed to be a nonpartisan event, there's a lot of, so there, if a candidate's there, they're not supposed to be talking about the election at all. And you really want to keep that event nonpartisan. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, on the organization, the moderator, to do everything they can to keep it nonpartisan. The reality is you can't control everything that people are going to say, right? Or what questions are going to be asked. Though what we often would suggest is make the ground rules very clear to people who are there. Make the ground rules very clear to the person speaking. And as a moderator, you have to use your judgment about when you may have to get up and say, this is not an appropriate forum for that question. It's a judgment call, but I think setting the ground rules helps both to keep people educated, so hopefully it's less likely to happen, but also if there's press or reports on the event as a partisan event, that you can at least demonstrate you did everything you could to keep it nonpartisan. Just very quickly, if it is actually an event where you were preventing people to talk about their candidacy, then you can make statements like, if elected, I will do this or I will do that, provided every candidate gets that same opportunity, whether it's at a debate where they're all on the same stage, or a sequential forum where someone's coming to a dinner each Friday or has an interview each week.
Great. So now getting into more of some of the issue advocacy pieces.
Okay.
Can 501c3s encourage people to vote their values, such as encourage people to vet candidates based on X issue? So I think we're getting into rhetoric and how can we, not cross lines, but still bring up the issues that matter to our org. So
right.
Maybe you're not mentioning candidates, but you're saying it's important to vote for candidates who, the example here is support funding childcare. Where is that line? How do we navigate that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the line probably has changed over time. This is one of those examples of facts and circumstances. What do we think is safe to do? There was a point in time where we would say, if it's an issue, it clearly supports that one candidate supports and another doesn't, and you say, you use this as your litmus test for voting for a candidate. You cannot vote for a candidate who takes this position on workers' rights, and then so-and-so candidate takes that position. I would have said that was risky. There is some guidance, some cases that has come down where sort of that supports that if you talk about a specific issue, your value, and you tell people about how you think about that in terms of a voting criteria, that as long as you're not talking about candidate, if you don't mention any candidate names, you should be okay. That is more flexible than I might have said a few years ago. So I think if you're using it as a litmus test, it's a continuum of risk tolerance. I think there's greater risk if it's a wedge issue where I can hear that. I think one question you can always ask yourself is, as a person hearing that, it's going to be clear to me who I should vote for. The more it is, I think the greater risk there is. So I think you keep that in mind when you're making a statement. Similar to statements like vote your values, I think very generic like that should be fine, right? Because if I can say, well, my value may be different than yours, and so I may vote for this candidate, not that candidate, then I think you're fine. But if it's about a very specific issue that divides the candidates, there's greater risk. And again, but it does help if at the very least you're not mentioning the candidates or the election, you're not mentioning the candidates who are in the election.
Great.
And I'm happy to go over a few minutes if that would be helpful.
Yeah, we'll go for a few more minutes, take a few more. There are more than we could even answer in a few, so we'll maybe follow up after, but we'll do a few more.
Sure.
We have one about C3s working with a super PAC. Could a C3 participate in voter outreach programming like phone banks, postcards, or texting with a super PAC or other sort of partisan organization if the scripts and voter universe are nonpartisan?
Yeah, very good question. So The problem here is you've got two very different sides of the spectrum with respect to tax status. A C3, we talked about, cannot, as a third rail, you cannot get involved with partisan electoral activity. A super PAC, on the other hand, or any kind of PAC, that's a typical political organization where if you look at their tax status, they typically is a political organization for tax purposes, which means that's all they're supposed to be doing is political work. So they're kind of like oil and water. The general advice is that a charity should not be working with any kind of PAC or super PAC at all. You want to keep those very, very separate because one taints the other. You can take the position that everything's nonpartisan about the voter universe or the issues, but the fact is you're working with a super PAC whose very existence is to get certain candidates elected. So we generally want to keep the C3 and the political organizations very separate. I don't think you could rely on those nonpartisan factors when you're working with another organization that is by its nature partisan. The last point I'll make on that is this is an area where a 501c4 organization in between a charity and a political organization can be a very effective way to have activities that may involve a C3 and a political organization that can't be working together. The C4 organization, which is allowed to do some partisan political activity, can work with both. And so that's often why you might see, you typically will always see a C4 in between, and you don't want direct collaboration or coordination between the C3 or the super PAC. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you.
You're making it much more challenging for me.
I'm going to do this was one of the first questions we got. I hope you're still on, Janet. I guess the League of Women Voters, or at least this chapter, has a policy of only working on candidate forums with organizations that have not endorsed a candidate. So what are your thoughts on this? Is this necessary for the League to be an honest broker in coordinating and managing forums?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to preface this with a lot of this is facts and circumstances. I can't really give legal advice based on what you're telling me. However, my initial reaction would be, how do we not taint the activities of the charity if it's working with an organization that has endorsed? So I think that, I think it may be an uphill battle. It's not, I mean, categorically, if this was a political organization, like you said earlier, you just don't work, you don't have the two working together. If you're talking about work, I don't know what the organization would be that would have endorsed. It can't be another charity, since a charity can't endorse a candidate. So are we talking about a 501c4 organization? I don't know. But I think there is a question about how do you both collaborate with the organization and take the position that you haven't tainted your event some way. I think we'd have to look at the facts to see if there's any possible way to do that. But I would have a concern, and often, I think that could be a situation where, and I have seen the media also see that collaboration and sort of talk about the C3 and the C4 together. And that can be enough smoke for the IRS to want to see if there's fire, right? Because that certainly, if they see anything, because sometimes a C3 and a C4 may have a joint event, and that can create risk because the 501c4 can do some partisan work. And then you see promotional materials that includes the C3's name. Even if the C3, there's an attribution issue there. So I do have some concerns that some of the C4 activity or any endorsement activity could be attributed to the charity in a way that you don't want.
Okay, we're going to do one more. We're going to stay on the C4 subject.
Okay.
I think this is a really interesting question.
Glad you saved it for last.
Can a C3, well, it just came in, so thank you, Carson. Can a C3 receive funds from a C4 for voter education if the C4 has a position on the candidates?
Yeah, very good question. So now we're just talking about flow of funds. And I think, again, this is going to be a very general answer. And this is the kind of thing where how you structure it really makes a big difference. The general answer is, can you have money flow from the C4 to the charity to do something that's nonpartisan? I would say yes. The answer is yes. But how does that money get from the C4 to the C3, I think is a question. Is it a grant? I'm assuming maybe it's a grant. And maybe we want to have, we want to know if there's any restrictions on how that money is to be used. But I think you can, it's sort of, again, the money flowing in that direction, the C3 by its tax-exempt status is limited to charitable activities. So I think you would look at the actual activities that get paid for And was there any language in, if it's a grant agreement or whatever went along with the money, that to indicate that money had to be used in some partisan way? I will say you more often see money flowing the other way, which the question would be, charity money given to a C4 for charitable purposes. Is that okay? Because that's charitable money, there's a greater risk. And yes, it's okay, but it really has to be restricted for charitable purposes. For your question, I think it's really, the money doesn't need to be restricted for charitable purposes, but the charity should very well document how it used the money and be clear that what it did eventually use the money for was nonpartisan. But the money could come from a C4 if that's how the C4 wanted to spend its money. But we typically see it the other way. That's all.
Okay, so our C3s maybe should start fundraising from C4s and not just private foundations.
Right. I mean, and the reason is because the C4 money goes to the C3, you've now restricted the money further. Right. And so a lot of times it's the other way around, because the C4 has that money that's actually, assuming it's not restricted by a donor, it could be used for some partisan work. You may want to keep that money flexible, but if you give the money to charity, it's permissible, but you've now restricted the money further than maybe it would have been had the C4 spent it directly.
Well, we had a lot of good questions today. But like I said, there are some that I will follow up maybe with a Q&A document in the follow-up materials, because there was really great participation and questions. Thank you, David, for another great Staying Nonpartisan webinar. Really appreciate it.
Happy to do it. I hope it was helpful. There's always more information than we can cover, which is always the hardest part about this, but I hope it was helpful for people who attended.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Everyone, have a great week.